Spanish Lesson 19. Indirect Object Pronouns. An introduction. What is the indirect object pronoun? The indirect object tells us to whom or for whom the direct object is. Have a look at the sentence below. She buys a present for Pedro. Direct object is a present. For whom is the present? For Pedro. Indirect object is Pedro. When to use the indirect object pronoun? We use the indirect object to indicate to whom or for whom the action of the verb is performed. Let's look at the example again. She buys a present for Pedro. For whom does she buy the present? For Pedro. Indirect object equals Pedro. An implied direct object. Sometimes the direct object is not stated, instead it is implied. Let's look at the example below. He told him. Although the direct object is not explicitly stated in this sentence, it is implied. What this sentence means literally is, he told it to him. Thus, the direct object is it. Direct object equals it, implied, and the indirect object equals him. How to identify the indirect object? Use these rules to help you identify the indirect object. The indirect object tells us to whom or for whom the direct object is. The indirect object answers the question to whom or for whom the action of the verb is performed. The indirect object pronouns. When a pronoun replaces the name of the indirect object, use the following pronouns.
Me,
te, you familiar,
le,
him, her, or you formal,
nos,
us,
os,
you plural familiar,
les.
them, you all formal. The position of the indirect object pronoun. In an affirmative statement with one verb, the indirect object pronoun comes immediately before the conjugated verb. Have a look at the following examples.
Luis me escribe un poema.
Luis writes me a poem. Luis writes a poem for me.
Luis te escribe un poema.
Luis writes you a poem. Luis writes a poem for you.
Luis le escribe un poema.
Luis writes him or her a poem. Luis writes a poem for him or her.
Luis nos escribe un poema.
Luis writes us a poem. Luis writes a poem for us.
Luis os escribe un poema.
Luis writes you, familiar, plural, a poem. Luis writes a poem for you, familiar, plural.
Luis les escribe un poema.
Luis writes them a poem. Luis writes a poem for them. The meaning of the indirect object pronoun. Have a look at the phrases below and their English equivalents.
Me escribo.
I write to for me.
Te escribo.
I write to for you.
Le escribo.
I write to for him or her.
Nos escribo.
I write to or for us.
Os escribo.
I write to for you plural.
Les escribo.
I write to or for them. Have a look at the phrases below. They all consist of an indirect object pronoun and a conjugated verb. Note that while the subject of the verb changes, the indirect object remains the same.
Me escribe.
He writes to me.
Me escribís.
You plural write to me.
Me escriben.
They write to me. The indirect object pronouns le and les. Be careful with the indirect object pronouns le and les because they can stand for different things.
Le.
To or for him, to or for her, or to or for you formal.
Les.
To or for them, or to or for you plural formal. For example,
Yo le cuento una historia. Yo les cuento una historia.
although both sentences are grammatically correct, they are ambiguous. There is no way to deduce the meaning when used out of context.
Yo le cuento un chiste.
I tell him a joke, or I tell her a joke, or I tell you formal a joke.
Yo les cuento un chiste.
I tell them a joke, or I tell you plural formal a joke. The addition of a prepositional phrase for clarification. Because of this ambiguity, a prepositional phrase is often added after le or les to clarify the meaning, as shown in these examples.
Yo le cuento a Néstor un chiste. Yo le cuento a Micaela un chiste. Yo le cuento a usted un chiste. Yo les cuento a mis amigos un chiste. Yo les cuento a ustedes un chiste.
The addition of a prepositional phrase for emphasis. Sometimes a prepositional phrase is added purely for emphasis. There is no ambiguity in the following sentence. It can only mean one thing.
Andrés me cuenta un chiste.
Andrés tells me a joke. Thus, the addition of a prepositional phrase merely adds emphasis.
Andrés me cuenta a mí un chiste.
Andrés tells me a joke.